We come into contact with Lee in early 2012 through an organization called Students and Scholars Against Corporate Misbehavior, SACOM, an NGO based in Hong Kong. Debbie Chan, who works for SACOM, agrees to travel with us to Zhuhai to meet Li Wen, who lost a hand while cutting machine parts at an electronics and household goods manufacturer. We take an hour-long ferry ride from Hong Kong to Zhuhai. After we dock, Debbie reaches Lee by cell phone. He's running a bit late, so we decide to eat at a small place inside the ferry terminal. It is during this meal that Debbie tells us about a previous trip she took to this very location to meet with factory workers as part of the work she does for SACOM. She says she began to suspect that two men were following her, so she took a long and winding route through the terminal, and the two men were behind her everywhere she went. She says she doesn't know who they were. Maybe from the government? Maybe the company? Eventually, Lee arrives with two friends who also lost hands in factory accidents. Lee strikes us immediately as a warm, friendly person. He's about 5'4", with longish black hair that sweeps to one side. He wears a t-shirt and long orange shorts, and he keeps one forearm tucked into his shorts pocket at all times. As we walk to find a private place to conduct the interview, we notice a black sedan drive past us and park at the curb, then drive and park again as we walk by. We ask Debbie if we're being followed, and if we should be worried. Definitely, she says. But they're not going to attack us or anything. They just want to know who we are. Eventually, we find a nearby empty restaurant with a private room. Lee is eager to tell his story. We talk for close to 3 hours, Debbie working hard to translate between us. The following narrative comes almost entirely from that one conversation. Names and details have been changed to protect the identity of the narrator and his friends. My hometown is in Longhui County in Shaoyang Prefecture of Hunan Province. I grew up in a house that was built in the 1960s or 70s. It's really old. There are many old houses in my village, and the living conditions are really poor. Many houses don't have electricity, and in my home, we don't have any electrical appliances. No fan, television, or refrigerator. There's not even much furniture, just a couple of beds. And for heat, we burn firewood and sometimes coal. I'm the only child in my family, and I'm short, because when I was young, I didn't get enough nutrition. My parents were very old. My father is 62 years old now, and my mother is 59. They both worked in coal mining when they were young, so they're not in good health. Their bodies are weak. Sometimes they work as temporary laborers in the local community, doing things like cutting trees or demolishing old houses or construction work on new houses. But that work is really unsteady. The jobs might only last 3 to 5 days, but like many of the villagers, they farm for much of the year. Most people grow rice or peanuts. The farm we have is allocated to us by the state, and the rice we grow is mainly for feeding the pigs and other livestock and for feeding ourselves. My family grows all the rice we eat, and most of the vegetables. Sometimes, if there are vendors selling meat, then we'll buy some. In my neighborhood, there are about 100 residents, but in the whole village, I don't know exactly, maybe 1,000? The neighborhoods are near each other, so I can walk to the others. It's convenient. Only a few people own cars, and they use them for business. Things like transporting coal into the villages. Still, there's not much work to do near my hometown other than farm. Many young people go out to look for jobs, so mostly only the elderly remain in the village. When I was 16, Longhui Vocational School, I studied electrical appliances, but other majors included computers, fashion design, arts, molding, and mechanics. My grades were good, but because I'm poor, I didn't have the opportunity to go to university. In fact, I'm really lucky that I could go to vocational school because of the poor economic situation in my home. I thought I might only be able to finish junior high because when I was in 9th grade, my father had a problem with his eye, and then a problem with his stomach at the same time. So much money went for his treatment that the only way I was able to go to vocational high school was because of subsidies from the school and because my family sold our cow. We got 800 won for the cow, and my father borrowed 600 from his friend in the same village. And my father's eye was treated successfully, so he was able to return to work. Otherwise, I would not have been able to go to school. In my first month of vocational school, I also borrowed money from my friends in order to survive. The school fees were around 1,400 to 1,500 won for the semester, and the cost of living was around 100 won per month. The first few years of school, I was in the top 3 of my class, but in the third year, I didn't concentrate as much on studying. I just wanted to graduate and go look for jobs. It was my dream that after 5 years working outside the village, I would have enough money to return home and renovate my family's house with bricks and cement. In my final year at vocational school, I was already hoping I would leave my hometown to work in the city. I graduated in June 2007. I was 19 years old. At that time, my school organized a training for migrant workers, which I attended. The training covered only the basics of electronics, which I'd already learned in school, but the other students who enrolled in the training would be recommended by the school for a factory job. After that, in August, other students from the same province as me. The journey by bus and train took around 17 hours and cost me 140 won, a little less than half of what my family had given me before I left. It was the last time I asked for money from my family. I had never been outside my hometown before, and I knew nothing about what Shenzhen would look like, but I was curious to see a new place, and I had big aspirations. In Shenzhen, everything was new and exciting. It was the first time I'd seen so many high-rise buildings, the first time I'd seen neon lights, the first time I'd seen so many cars on the road. I had never been in an elevator before. Shenzhen felt like a great city to be in, and my hometown now seemed like such a tiny place. I became friends with the people I'd traveled to Shenzhen with, and then we met even more new friends in Shenzhen who were really nice. They took us along to try many things in the city, including the food there. I was pretty excited about all of it. I got my first job at an electronics factory there because my vocational school had a student placement arrangement with the factory. The factory compound was made up of about 7 buildings, and there was probably 2,000 people working there. All my other friends went to work on the production line, but I was the only one of us assigned to quality control. I don't know why I got that position, but I guess the management believed I could handle it. Those of us in quality control had to inspect printed circuit boards for computers. We used a magnifying glass to examine the boards for defects, but the management believed that the female workers were more careful about this, so usually they did this part, and I usually handled the circuit boards that were sent back. Most of the employees in quality control are female workers. Another guy and I were the only males. I worked very hard while I was there, and I had a lot of fun. When I had free time, I would play basketball or badminton. I went hiking or running. I was optimistic about my future then. After I'd been working there for several months, in November 2007, my face swelled up. I still don't know what caused it, if it was an infection or a tumor or what. I went right away to a doctor at the largest hospital in Shenzhen, and the medical opinion was that I should have surgery immediately. But I didn't have any family in Shenzhen who could take care of me while I recovered, so I took leave from the factory and went back to my hometown to have the surgery there, to have the swelling relieved. The job at the electronics factory was my first job, and I didn't know much about labor law then. When I left to have the surgery, I did not receive any salary while I wasn't working. On my wage stub from the time, it actually stated that I owed the factory a few won. I stayed in my hometown until after the Lunar New Year, and then I returned to work at that factory in Shenzhen and stayed there for 4 or 5 more months. I worked really hard at the time because I wanted to learn some new skills from the factory and then look for a better job with a better career path. I left that job around July 2008 and looked for another job. It took me around 3 weeks, and then I was hired at the Lenovo factory to work on the production line. Our department was responsible for assembling the LCD monitors, fixing different components. At that time, the basic wage was slightly over 900 won per month, but the overtime premium was calculated in accordance with law, which meant that on weekdays, the overtime payment was 1.5 times the hourly wage, and then on weekends, the hourly wage was doubled. In the low season, I could earn 1,300 to 1,400 won per month, but in the peak season, my wages were 1,800 to 1,900 won. In terms of wages, it was a good factory. A lot of factories pay only around 1,500 won to the workers, so the treatment at Lenovo was good. I was hired there as a temporary worker. Usually the factory would convert temporary workers to regular workers after 3 months, but because of the financial crisis, this didn't happen. At the end of the year, the factory laid off all of the temporary workers. I wanted to go back to my hometown to celebrate the Lunar New Year in 2009, but my cousins, who worked at the factory in Zhongshan, a few hours by bus from Shenzhen, asked me to come celebrate the holiday with them, which I did. I had a friend working at a factory here in Zhuhai, which is south of Zhongshan, about 2 hours by bus, and he suggested that I apply for a job here. Because he already worked there and gave me a recommendation, it meant I'd be able to work right after the Lunar New Year ended, so I ended up in Zhuhai. At the factory in Zhuhai, I produced parts for rice cookers, and I fixed screws in the lids of the rice cookers. Like Shenzhen, Zhuhai is very different from my hometown. It's much more prosperous, like Shenzhen, and there are lots of places to hang out for fun, like playing basketball or using the internet. But there are also many trees, and there is the ocean. The scenery is beautiful. When I'm at home with my family, I usually have 2 meals a day, at 8 in the morning and then around 3 in the afternoon. If I'm really hungry, then I might have an additional meal in the evening. The main thing I eat at home is rice, but when I was in Zhuhai, I would usually have 3 or sometimes 4 meals a day because of the work cycle of the factory. I worked hard and had to eat more, but my diet was more varied as well. I stayed in Zhuhai for only 3 months because the wages were too low. I could make only around 1,300 to 1,400 won per month, so I left in April of that year, 2009. I went back to Shenzhen to look for work of that year, 2009. I went back to Shenzhen to look for work, but because of the financial crisis, I couldn't find a job. Then, around that time, my cousin Li Fang, my uncle's daughter, called to tell me my father was suffering from a very bad stomach ulcer, so in May I returned home. When I got there, I accompanied my father to visit the doctor. The treatment lasted for 10 days and was successful, so he didn't need surgery. I wasn't worried about not having a job during that time. I believed there were plenty of opportunities that would be available. And sure enough, in June, just as a couple of weeks after my father's treatment, a friend called me about a job at the Electech factory in Zhuhai. He was working in the quality assessment department, and he told me that his department was recruiting new employees. I left my hometown again. I applied to Electech for a job as a quality assessment officer. In the final stage of the interview process, a female worker who had worked previously at Electech for a number of years. Ultimately, she got the job. So I applied to work as an ordinary worker in the same factory, and I was hired. My salary was around 1,500 won a month. I lived in a dormitory at Electech. The room had 5 bunk beds, and it had a bathroom where we could all take a shower. It also had 2 fans, but we had to buy the pillows and bedding ourselves. In the dormitory, roommates were usually from the same department, and if we were off work at the same time, we would mostly chat with each other or play cards. Sometimes, I would have a day off, and my roommates would still have to work. But for the public holidays, like the national days, then usually all of us would have the day off. When I was off work, I liked to play chess or hang out in the city. I also went to the seashore, which was really nice. I had never seen the sea before moving to Zhuhai. The ocean is so big and wide, and when I looked out at it, I was assigned to the molding department. There were 30 to 40 people working in my section, but there were other sections in the factory doing the same work. I would get up at 6 in the morning and go to work around 7. And when I finished work, it was around 8 in the evening. I worked 11 hours a day, which doesn't include the meal breaks, usually 6 days a week. But if the department was really busy, I worked 7 days. Usually it's 1 or 2 people operating a machine, and each machine makes different things. I worked on different products. I produced parts for kitchen equipment, for example. But sometimes I had no idea, because we produced just that one component on the line, and then other workers would assemble the components. Usually the material was steel, and after I put the material in the machine, I would step on a pedal, and the upper parts of the machine would press down to stamp the metal to shape the component we were making at the time. Sometimes the sheet metal was really big, and then we needed 2 workers to put the metal into the machine. And then we needed 2 workers to put the metal into the machine. And when we were working with the bigger size metal, usually there wasn't a pedal, but 2 big buttons. You had to use both hands for the buttons, which was safer, because if both hands were on the buttons, they couldn't get trapped in the machine when it clamped down. I'd heard stories about injuries at factory, for example. I heard of one worker who lost 3 fingers and another who lost part of his middle finger, but I didn't give it much thought at the time. Only later did I become aware that injuries are really common in that department. It was very hot on the shop floor and very noisy, but we were given earplugs. The sound came from the molding machines. When the machines pressed down to make shapes out of the metal sheets, the metal clashing with each other. But if we had to talk to our coworkers, we could still hear them. All the machines were very close to each other, just a 50-centimeter gap between them. When I finished shaping the part, and then other workers would come by and collect those pieces, I had to stand while operating the machines, and at the end of the day, I would be really tired, and my hands and legs would be sore. In July, a month after I'd gone to work at the Electech factory, I started working on the night shift. July 10th, 2009 was the day everything changed. I started working at 8 p.m. At 11 p.m., I had a meal break for 30 minutes, and then I went back to work. The machine I was working on, the pressing machine, was 3 to 4 meters tall, and the color was almost white, with rust seeping through the paint. You might not know by looking at it, but it was really old. But I remember it was made in the 70s or 80s. The date was printed on the machine. The material I was working with was small pieces of metal, and I was operating the machine with a pedal. I would step on the pedal, and the machine would press down. I was doing this for a long time, working very fast. I was tired all the time. A small scrap of metal inside the machine that I needed to remove. Because if I didn't, the next piece of metal I would put in would have some defect in it. I reached my left hand in to grab the scrap metal. I don't know how it happened. When the machine came down on my hand, I screamed out. It was really painful and there was a lot of blood. I can't remember what I was thinking at the time. I just screamed and clenched my teeth. I was brought to the entrance of the factory. I don't remember who brought me there. My mind had almost gone blank, and I just wanted to go to the hospital as soon as possible. I had to wait for 20 minutes until a minibus arrived to pick me up. And then it took another hour to reach the hospital. After the examination at the hospital, the doctor said I needed surgery. I couldn't think clearly, but I was asked to sign something. I realized that it was really severe only after the surgery was done. The doctor numbed my arm, but I was conscious the entire time. All I could think was that the doctor numbed my arm, but I was conscious the entire time. All I could think was that I hoped the surgery would be over as soon as possible. I could not see what was happening because there was a cloth covering my eyes, but I could hear the sound of the saw cutting my bone, and even though they numbed my arm, I could still feel the pain. It was the most painful experience of my life. I stayed in the hospital for 16 days after they amputated my hand. That whole time I was very depressed. I didn't call my family. I didn't call anyone. I didn't want to upset them. While I was in the hospital, I met a lot of people who had suffered work injuries like me. Most of them said the same thing, that they weren't going to tell their families until after they'd been treated. After 16 days, I was discharged. Later, people asked me why I was sent out so soon, but at that time, I didn't think to ask why. I felt completely helpless. I didn't know what to do, or went on medical leave and started receiving medical leave payments of 1,380 won each month from the company. I put all my time into trying to deal with my injury. On August 10th, 2009, I went for an examination to determine my work capacity, now that I had lost my hand. It had been a month since the accident, and it was around this time that I decided to tell my family what had happened. I called my cousin, my uncle's daughter, and told her first, because I was worried about my parents, how they would take the news. My parents are old. My cousin is the one who told my parents what happened to me. In September, I went to be fitted for an artificial hand at a company that makes prostheses, but the one they gave me was very uncomfortable. It was not as good as I had imagined. It was clumsy and too big for me. I don't use it. On December 2nd, I was certified as having a grade 5 injury. This was really detrimental because a grade 5 meant I could not receive the full workers' compensation for my accident. Grade 10 is the lowest you can receive. It means you get the lowest amount of compensation, and grade 1 is the highest. I don't know what the amounts are for each grade, but I think that because of my injury, I should have been at least a grade 4, since I couldn't do the same work I'd been trained to do anymore. On December 14th, a lawyer came to handle my case. My uncle had arranged this. The lawyer told me I could get 23,760 won from Social Security as compensation for my accident. And then the next day, the lawyer negotiated with one of the managers from the company, someone who takes care of industrial injuries. My lawyer asked that I get another examination because the grade 5 certification was too low, but the manager from the company said the law did not require them to offer another examination. In the end, the company said 1 won, in addition to the 23,760 from Social Security. The company gave me 2 options. One was to go back to work at the factory. In this case, I would have been allowed to take only a portion of the compensation. I don't know what the company would have had me do at the factory, and I didn't ask because there was no way I was going back there. The second option was to officially resign from the company and accept the full compensation they were offering, which wasn't enough. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to think about things. A week after the lawyer told me my options, I went back home. This was the first time my parents had seen me since my hand was amputated. When I saw them, I just cried out, "Father and Mother." I couldn't say anything else. Their hair had turned grayer since I'd last seen them, and the way they looked at me now was different. In the eyes of my parents, when they looked at me, there was sadness. I stayed there for the Lunar New Year at the beginning of 2010. I took leave from the factory and rested in my hometown. It was peaceful, but I was also confused about what my future might hold. My cousin helped me find another lawyer who was willing to offer legal assistance. The lawyer we found was helpful. When he contacted me, I was touched by his sincerity. I didn't ask much advice from my parents because they're not well educated and don't know much. They just wanted me to get as much compensation as possible. On April 22nd, I left my hometown again to return to Zhuhai, where I stayed with a friend. I negotiated with one of the managers from the company several times, but his attitude remained the same. We did everything in accordance with the law. So on May 18th, 2010, I officially resigned from the company. That was the only way I could get the compensation. 90,921 was too low. So after my resignation, I decided to bring a lawsuit against the company. I filed a complaint in the court in June, and the case was first heard by the court on the July 29th. I lost that suit because I had already been paid settlement money. Many people have asked how much money I received, and when I tell them, they ask me why I accepted it. Unfortunately, according to the legal standards, it was the only amount I could get. Eventually, after a series of injuries, Walmart conducted several audits at the factory, but Electech used a lot of deception tactics. I've talked to people who have been injured but still work in the factory. These are people whose injuries aren't as serious as mine. People who have lost maybe one finger or a few fingers, and they tell me during their audits, Electech would put the injured people on leave so they weren't in the factory when the Walmart people were there. I don't know if they were paid while they were off work. I also know 2 other guys who lost a hand at the same factory. When I talked to them by phone, I found out they had both accepted compensation for their injuries, but now they've gone back to their hometowns, and I haven't talked to them. My family had planned to rebuild our house in Shaoyang in March 2010, because at that time our relatives planned to rebuild theirs, and our houses are connected to each other. But it took a long time because we had to sort out the money. During the renovation of the house, we lived with one of my uncles, but the construction is done now, and my family has moved back into the house. In August 2010, I moved back to my hometown to live with my parents, though I still come to Zhuhai often. Still, There are lots of inconveniences in my life. For example, when I was working on the house, when I had to carry the bricks, I could carry only 2 bricks with one hand. There were builders, and we had to prepare the materials for rebuilding the house. My father bought the cement mix and mixed it with water to prepare the cement, and then I had to carry the cement to the builders. But living with one hand, so many things are difficult, and there are just things I cannot do. After my accident, and after I returned home, some journalists showed up to interview me. One was from the Wall Street Journal, another was from Beijing, the Global Times, and another was from some journal on work-related injuries. They asked me questions about how I was injured and where I'd been working, and even someone from the government came to talk to me, but I don't remember much of what he asked. In the end, I was disappointed with the government. They didn't care about what happened to me. They were hoping I wouldn't make trouble or draw more public attention. I think the government could help me in several ways, like helping me find a job or start a business, but the government doesn't care about poor families like us. Still, after the journalist showed up, the company agreed to pay me an additional 130,000 won, as long as I agreed not to talk to any more journalists about my injury. I accepted the money, so now I have to be careful when talking about my story. So now I've received a all total compensation of about 240,000 won. I'm grateful for the assistance, although I think it's still not enough. For example, in rebuilding my home, I've already spent 130,000 won, so there is not much left. There is a policy that the government will provide subsidies to impoverished families for renovating their houses. But last year, I was not in my hometown, and when I returned and went to the Civil Affairs Office for a consultation, the officer there told me the resources were limited. He said there was enough for only 1 or 2 families in a village to receive the subsidy, but no one had applied for it. So the officer said that in order to keep the money from going to waste, the government had allocated the subsidy to the village secretary, which is something like a mayor of the village. He got to keep the money himself. To this day, I feel frustrated and helpless. The place where my hand was amputated continues to ache. It's very painful. Even now, I still feel pain, and the problem cannot be resolved. I don't have any medication. Even when I visit the doctor, he said it was normal to have pain and did not give me any medication. I've gone to the hospital several times, but they're always telling me there's no problem. And sometimes I feel my hand there, and it feels cold. Sometimes it really hurts, and sometimes it's just numb. I imagine my future will be difficult. I've spent a lot of time on the house, but now that we've finished with that renovation, I really need to sort out my future plans. I'm worried about my parents. I worry about their health because of their age. I feel I have care of them. When I was able to work in the factories, that was the major source of our income. But my father will still go out to find temporary work when he can. Although most of the young people have left my hometown, I still have my cousin who has a newborn baby. My hometown is surrounded by mountains, but this year, hopefully, the main country road will connect to our town, so it will be much easier for us to go to other towns. I expect that after the new road connects here, there will be a public bus that will come to our hometown. I'm thinking about starting my own business, but I don't know what kind of business I would do. I don't feel very confident, and I don't have any experience. I don't have a clear plan about how I should work it out, and now I only have about 100,000 won left from the settlement. I'm worried about having enough capital, because in my hometown, if I have to rent a place to start my business, the rent is about 50,000 to 1,000 won per year. Right now, I come to Zhuhai often to meet with other workers who have been in factory accidents and to share my story so that others understand what's going on in China, including other young Chinese workers like me who may not understand the dangers of their work. My relatives feel pity for me because they think the compensation I got wasn't reasonable. They think I was too young to have handled the negotiations. I have to come up with a plan of some kind. I also hope to have my own family. I'd like to get married, but that might be difficult. I'd like to find a nice girl, but she'll need to accept my disability.